Welcome you all on behalf of the University of Florida IFAS Extension Polk County. Welcome to our webinar today. We've got a wonderful guest speaker today. One of our Master Gardener volunteers, Tom, will be presenting on the topic today. Again, thank you all so much for joining us. And Tom, take it away.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Julie, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us here on this chilly Florida day, assuming everybody's in Florida. If you're somewhere else, you're probably even colder. So anyway, we're going to talk about container gardening today, which is one of my favorite things to do, and I'm very passionate about it. So hopefully we can help get you all going in the right direction and answer some of the questions that you have regarding going forward with container gardening. The topics for today, we're going to talk about Florida-friendly principles and how they apply to container gardening. Why gardens with containers, why do that? The container choices that we have, the planning and planting in containers, care and maintenance, and sample container gardens. We'll actually share with you some photos of some of my landscape as well as some of the other master gardeners as we go. Now, the focus today on the container gardening is really more on outdoor gardening, but a lot of these principles apply to indoor gardening as well, if you're into doing that also. So if you're not familiar with the 9 principles of Florida friendly, we've got the right plant, right place, watering efficiently, fertilize appropriately, mulch, attracting wildlife, manage yard pests, recycling yard waste, reduce stormwater runoff, and protecting the waterfront. Now, not all of these apply directly to container gardening, so we're going to focus on the 6 that I've highlighted there that have a more of a direct impact on your container gardening. So right plant, right place. Of course, this is probably one of the most important for any type of gardening that you may do. It's probably even more important with container gardening, because you're really going to try to create what we call a microenvironment, which is based on the plant culture, what the plant needs and wants regarding water, light, soil, and temperature. And then you're going to want to place those plants where its needs and yours are met. And we'll talk more in detail on how you go about doing that. Of course, watering efficiently, you want to know the needs of the plant. Potting mixture is very critical regarding container gardening. You want to check your pots frequently for water, and you want to collect rainwater. I always tell people, take advantage of what Florida gives us in the summertime with the rainwater. Your plants will be very happy with it, and your budget will as well. You want to water in the morning when you do water. And just remember, with container plants, dry soil repels the water, and they tend to get pushed down in the soil more because of the hard rain that we get and the heat in Florida. We'll talk a little bit more about how to maintain and care for those type of issues. And then, of course, take advantage of micro irrigation. But I will caution you that needs to be monitored. You don't want to just turn it on and then let it go, because you might not water enough or you might water too much. And of course, manage pests responsibly. You're going to manage the microenvironment for that plant in the container. A healthy plant will resist disease. And you want to implement what we call integrated pest management, which basically is you taking the initiative on a regular basis to look at your plants, examine them, look for pests, look under leaves to make sure that you can avoid pests. You're not going to, of course, avoid pests 100%, but by taking it on an implemented integration pest management process, it allows you to catch things before it gets out of hand. And a lot of times it's just a matter of picking a leaf off or squishing a bug. But if you do have to treat the plant, you want to spot treat them. And just remember, the label is the law. However you're using pesticides, you want to make sure that you follow the label as directed. And then, of course, you want to take advantage and ensure that you're protecting the pollinators and wildlife. Just don't want to go crazy when you're using pesticides, because with those, you're going to usually kill the good bug with the bad bug. And of course, fertilizing appropriately. Fertilization is probably more important, I think, with container gardening than it is in your landscape. And I would highly recommend to go with a slow release granular type. They seem to be the most effective. It goes right on top of the soil. You sort of scrape it in and mix it in with the soil. And every time you water your plant, it will release some of the fertilizer slowly. It's a slow release, but that way it's always getting something all the time, every time you water it. And of course, use it directed. You don't want to go crazy and over fertilize. Know what the plant needs. And in some cases, you may need to check the pH, whether it's, the plant requires to be acidic or neutral. And of course, check the drainage. Well, we'll talk more about the drainage, which again is very, very important when it comes to container gardening. You can actually use mulch to help retain moisture with container gardening. You want to apply to the top of the soil. And of course, you want to try to attract wildlife. You can put plants in containers that attract butterflies. They provide nectar for the butterflies, fruit-bearing plants for the birds, and of course, flowers for the bees and the hummingbirds. Okay, on to the next one. Why garden in containers? There's a lot of good reasons to garden in containers. You might have limited space. You might be in a small area. Maybe you only have a patio to deal with, or a small lanai, or a small yard. It's convenient to garden with containers. You have flexibility with a container. You can change the plant out, you can change the container out, and you can move it around. You can easily add color, height, and texture. The texture not only applies to the plant, but it also applies to the container. I tell people you're sort of getting a double whammy with containers, because you're not only getting the plant, whatever the plant's giving you regarding flowers and textures, but you can also add color and texture and size with the container. Of course, annuals are a good fit for containers because they only grow at certain times a year here in Florida, as well as herbs and vegetables. And the container can provide a focal point. And we'll talk more about how you can do that within your landscape. Some other reasons to use containers: they enable you to do quick changes by repositioning or replanting. I like to move my plants around based on what that plant is doing. If it's in bloom, you can put that in an area where it's going to be the focal point of your landscape for people to see and for you to enjoy. When it's done blooming, you can move that one out, put another one in. It also allows you to fill a bare spot or arrange for a special day or a whole season. You can accommodate cold, hot, or windy conditions. You can move them out of harm's way. Sort of like what we've had to do the last couple of weeks of this whole winter. It's been a chilly one for Florida. You can use special soils for special plants, orchids, cactus, whereas in-ground landscape, you're a little bit more limited as to what you can plant where. So container gardening allows you to do other kinds of plants. And you can restrain certain plants. When I say restrain, control them, like mint or bamboo or sansevieria. These plants can actually be considered invasive if you put them in the ground because they spread so quickly. So they're a good candidate to use in a container because you can actually contain the roots and the spread of those plants and control them. And you can incorporate different microenvironments by grouping individual containers together. So for example, you might have an ivy in one container, a cactus in another, and another type of plant in another container. All three of those have different microenvironments, but they all have the same light requirements. You can actually group them together in your landscape. All three of them are going to be happy because they've got the right microenvironment, but it gives you that flexibility to do that, to group the plants together without planting them in the same container. Okay, we're going to talk about container choices. I mean, you really have whatever works for you, but I will caution you, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, depending on the type of container, that will affect whether or not that plant's going to be able to be healthy. And what I mean by that is different textures, right? You've got terracotta pots, you've got plastic, porcelain, rubber. There's all different kinds of containers you can use, but each of those will affect the drainage of that container and what the impact may or may not be on that plant. So it's just something that you need to consider when you decide on selecting a container. Just be aware of it. Small fruit in half barrels. And also you can also put vegetables in these type of barrels to keep them out of the ground, give you, again, a little bit more flexibility to grow fruit and or vegetables. Okay, planning and planting in containers. Okay, how do you go about doing this? Again, we talked about creating a microenvironment based on the plant's specific requirements of light, water, temperature, soil pH. You can do that by providing the right potting mix. A lot of plants, you've heard the saying, a lot of people, oh, that plant will grow anywhere. But if you really want that plant to thrive and be as healthy as it can be, you want to make sure that you do provide the correct potting mix, as well as fertilizer. Container material, we talked a little bit about this as far as the choice in the containers, whether it be plastic, porcelain, clay, terracotta. All of them have different, what I call breathability, which allows the roots to absorb the nutrients and water that they need. So a plastic pot or container is going to be a little bit tougher to provide breathability rather than a terracotta plant, which has a little bit more aeration within the container. It doesn't say that you can't use them, because I use both. It's just something to be aware of, because it will impact how you water that plant and the type of soil that you may want to amend to that container. The size of the container is also very important. You need to understand what kind of root structure that plant has. And what I mean by that, some plants have a shallow root system, so they're not going to be overly happy in a container that has a deep, that's real high. So it's more tolerant of a smaller pot. You've also got root structure that likes to go wide, so it can tolerate a wider plant. It may not be happy in a narrow plant. And same thing with a plant that has a massive root system that goes deep and wide. So it's just something that you want to be aware of when you select the container. Again, that's going to help the plant be as healthy as it can be. Also affects the drainage. And I want to emphasize drainage because you want to make sure that you've got holes in the bottom of the pots. Sometimes you'll go into the box stores, you'll buy plants that have that fancy paper wrapped around it, and you get home and you just start watering and doing your thing, and you wonder, why is this plant not doing well? And you take the paper off, you realize that there's no hole in the bottom of the plant. So it's very important that you make sure you've got drainage for whatever container that you select. And you can use containers in containers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I'll show you some examples of it. But some plants require a small container, but you may have a larger size container that's decorative. And you can just take that plastic container with the plant in it and place it in the other container. And you've accomplished two things. One, you've ensured that the plant is in a properly sized container, but you also can put it in a decorative container and place that in your landscape. And I'll have examples of what that looks like. The location of where you put those plants and containers also needs to be considered. Hanging plants, of course, will be exposed to the wind and the rain, and they'll dry out faster. If you place containers on concrete or pavers, they're going to dry out faster than they would be if you put them in landscape along with the bark. So again, this is just something to be aware of. It's not one's better than the other. You just want to make sure you understand where you're placing those plants, because that will impact how that plant grows and the effect of the water and other conditions we've talked about. Now, we've got a phrase, thrillers, spillers, and fillers. basically this is when you want to put multiple plants in the same container. You want to try to have a tall centered plant, a medium plant that sort of fills up the center of the container, and then trailers, plants that will hang over the container. But one of the most important thing to consider when you do this is you want to make sure all three of those plants have the same culture, the same light requirements, same water, same soil. Otherwise, you're going to have one or two plants. Some of the plants, somebody's not going to be happy, okay? Because the plants that like a lot of water, the plants that don't like a lot of water, you can't do both. So just make sure that you ensure that if you do put multiple plants in a container, that they all match the same culture requirements. And again, the thriller is the plant that gives you some height. You see in this example here, that's a grass, looks like some kind of grass plant. And then the filler, you've got the nice flowering plant there. And then the spiller, the plant that sort of hangs over the container. All of these plants have the same microenvironment requirements. So they're all going to be happy. When you water them, they're all going to get the same requirement. Okay, planting the plants. You want to make sure that whatever container you choose, you want to make sure the pot's clean. You can always, I like to wipe mine out with some bleach and water, and do it before you actually plant the plant. Make sure the pot is dry if you're going to go ahead and do that. But that'll clean out and kill any bacteria that might be in the pot. You want to make sure you use clean soil. Don't reuse soil. It's okay to maybe put that in your pile out in the back of the yard or something. But whenever you put a plant in a new container, you always want to start off with a clean pot and clean soil. Again, I emphasize making sure you've got the right drainage holes in the bottom of the pot. As we discussed, consider the shape of the pot to make sure that it's going to be happy with whatever that root structure is. If it has shallow root system, you don't want to put it in too deep a pot, because that may cause the pot and the roots to rot out. Prepare the specific soil mix for that plant. Succulents, cactus, they like a good drainage mix, sand and perlite, whereas you've got other plants that may like a peat moss in there to help keep that plant moist and hold the moisture in longer than it might. So once you've got your container and your soil mix ready, you want to partially fill up the container with soil. I always say fill it up to where you anticipate the bottom of the roots of the plant you're going to put in there will fall. And then you want to loosen up the roots of the plant that you're going to put in the container, put it in the center of the pot, and then finish filling up that container to the topmost roots of the plant, or even with the soil surface. You want to try to place the soil where that soil was in the pot that you took the plant out of to repot it. You want to try to keep the soil at a 1 to 2 inch below the rim of the container to allow for watering. So that way, when you do water the plant, if the soil level is too high, all that soil is going to just pour out over the container. So if you keep a 1 to 2 inch rim there, you should be fine. And as we talked about, you can always put mulch in there if it's a plant that likes to be wet. That'll help retain the moisture in there. And of course, as we've discussed, you want to make sure you follow the Florida Friendly Principles in your selection and placement of whatever plant that you decide to put in the container. And then you want to locate that plant to the proper location where it's going to get the light that it requires and where you want it to fit within your landscape. And then you want to water it. I suggest you always water it when it's in place, because when you water it, it's going to get heavy. It's going to be a little tougher to move. So make sure you put it where you're going to want to have that container, and then water it. Okay, now that we understand all the Florida Friendly Principles and we've selected a container, we've planted our plant in that container and placed it in the right location, how do we take care of it? First of all, you want to make sure you check the soil before you water it. Just don't assume that it needs water or that it might be too dry. I mean, living in Florida, we've got some advantages with that because we get the rain in the summer, all the sun, but at the same time, that makes it more challenging to have plants in containers because they're going to dry out faster. So you just want to make sure you check the soil before watering, avoid over and under watering. As we discussed earlier, you want to monitor for pests while you're watering your plant. Just look and make sure that everything's okay. Make sure you know your good bugs from the bad bugs, because you don't want to get rid of the ladybugs or whatever else might be helping your plant. Fertilize as needed. As I mentioned, the slow release fertilizer, I highly recommend that. But if you don't decide to use that, you want to make sure that you read the label and fertilize as needed. You don't necessarily have to fertilize every time you water the plant if you use a different fertilizer other than the slow release. Because we get the hard rains in the summertime, you're going to find that the soil is going to be flattened and hardened on top of the container. So you want to loosen it up if you can, and there's little tools that you can buy. They're actually a bonsai tool. They almost look like children tools. They're just a small version of what you use in your regular landscape, like a little mini rake, and you can carefully loosen up that soil. That's going to help the plant breathe. It's also going to help it bring and absorb the moisture that it does get. And if need be, in some cases, you need to amend the soil because that soil will go away. And you can always add some, but I want to make sure that you understand if you do amend the soil, you want to loosen the soil first, then amend the soil, put some more in there and mix that all together. And then you should be good as new. You want to move plants as seasons change based on light requirements. Again, here in Florida, come summertime, unless you've got a lot of canopy, tree cover in your landscape, you're going to be exposed to light no matter what you're facing, north, south, east, west. But in the wintertime, for those plants that are on the north side of your house in the summertime, they're not going to get any sun. So if you've got containers that you put on the north side in the summertime to get low light, just remember, come wintertime, that plant probably is going to need some light. So you're going to want to move it. And again, that's the advantage of container gardens. You can move them as the light changes throughout the seasons. Don't have to tell you, you want to protect them from temperatures as needed. Certainly have had to do that the last few weeks. It's been a chilly winter. So you want to make sure you protect them for those that do need protection. Repot when you need to repot them. Plants aren't going to stay in the same container forever. They're going to get bigger. The roots systems are going to grow. So you're going to need to repot them. And you can tell by just looking at the bottom of the pot, when you start seeing roots coming through the drainage hole, you know that it's time to repot that plant. You can also tell by the watering requirements. If you find yourself having to water the plant a lot, then you probably need to repot it. I like to repot in the late fall, winter, early spring, and avoid the summer, only because anytime you repot plants in the summertime, you're going to stress them out no matter what. So you reduce the stress by doing it when it's not quite so hot. It'll make it easier for the plant to transition to its new container. And as I've mentioned, just get yourself some proper tools for container gardening. Look online. There's all kinds of things you can buy out there. You'll find a lot of these under the bonsai tools. They're like little mini tools that you can use. They come in handy. They work out real well for container gardening, for getting into those small spaces. And of course, remove spent flowers before they go to seed. That encourages new growth and also new flowers by deadheading. Tip pruning. Sometimes container gardening, you'll get plants that may dry out a little sooner than they should have, and you'll get brown tips on the ends of the leaves. Just cut those out. It just makes them look nicer. And of course, it prevents plants from fading out too quickly. And it improves the appearance. You know, if you're going to get a container garden, you want to make them look nice. And so those are some of the things you can do to help make that happen. And check soil pH, particularly if you're doing fruits like blueberries or vegetables. Some other plants that you might put in containers have specific soil pH requirements, whether they require acid or neutral or alkaline. Just be aware of what you're growing and what the requirements are. And you can always come to the county extension office where we have testing available to check the pH in your soil, so that way you can make sure it matches with whatever plant you have in the container. Okay, some sample container gardens. Here's some pictures. Some of these are from mine. These are from my landscape. I like to group containers. You can also see that I've placed these in areas that there's really nothing there. The boxwoods there, they're basically slow growers. So I like to fill in the landscape. Another good use for containers is around trees. I don't typically like to put plants in the ground too close to the trees because that will impact the roots. And typically you'll get into a battle between the tree versus what you put in the ground. So a container with a plant is a nice alternative to give you something to put under the tree or around the tree, but there's no competition with that tree. So something to keep in mind when placing the plants throughout your landscape. You can also see on the right side here, I've got a planter, which is a head, but instead of actually planting into the container itself, I have a container into the container. That's what I talked about earlier. Just another option that you have. I also can take that container and move it somewhere else and put something else in there. Again, talking about the flexibility that you have by utilizing containers within your garden and landscape. Here on the right side here, this is a container. I think, yeah, this is one of my starter plants that I just placed in this little container. And as that plant gets bigger, I'll move it into a bigger container and bring something else in there. Again, some flexibility in moving your plants and placing it within your landscape. On the left side, you'll see here, I've got some container plants that I sort of, again, grouped together. The one in the background there, I've got a container in a container, the bigger container that has some soil in it. But I didn't have a plant to place in there at the time, so I just took another container plant and placed it on top of that to give me some height and just to utilize all of the containers that I have within the landscape. And here again on the right-hand side, you see I've got plants grouped together. And on the left here, just a little cactus with a little bloom there in a little container that, again, you can move around and place it anywhere you want. Again, that's what I like about the containers, is the flexibility of it. And to add a little, I mean, this little plant actually became the focal point within my landscape just because of the flower. Here's the front of my house. And this is, again, another example of placing containers within my landscape. I've got sunshine mimosa there as the ground cover. You see the little pink flowers. And then I've got a container of what they call a poor man's ground orchid in the pot there. And it's in bloom with some orange flowers. So I just plop that in the middle of the mimosa to get some focal point on that container and to add some height to it and just to do something different, move things around. And the plant up in the front there is a bromeliad. Again, a container in a container, because bromeliads don't require much in the way of a root system. They have a small root system, but I can utilize larger containers by placing the pot that's in, that the bromeliad's in, and place that in the larger container. And here again, just some fun things I do with the containers to place them within the landscape. On the right-hand side here, you'll see I've grouped some containers together, different heights. I also use containers as tables, if you will, within the landscape to elevate other plants, to give a little extra character to whatever I'm trying to do. Again, just emphasizing the flexibility that you have with container gardening. Okay, this plan I'm showing you for a couple reasons. Again, just to show you the idea of a container within a container. You can see this is again is a bromeliad, has a small root system, so I have it in a smaller plastic container, but I placed it in the other container that you see there on the left. The other thing I want to emphasize here is that cable box you see there is not something that I want to be part of my landscape. So I put it back in the container. You can see on the right-hand side here, I use it to actually hide the cable box to shield that from my landscape. So I get another benefit of using containers and them being flexible where I can move them around. I can actually hide things that I don't want to be seen within my landscape. And I don't particularly like digging in the ground near cables either. It just can cause problems. So this is just another benefit of using container gardens within your landscape. Here's some other Master Gardener containers. You'll see one of the patterns within some of the pictures I'm showing you is grouping containers together, some smaller containers. Bigger containers can stand on their own pretty easily within your landscape. Smaller containers, I would highly recommend to group them. It gives you a little bit more pop within the landscape. And again, on the right-hand side here, you'll see that plant is the what we talked about, the Thrilla, Spiller, and whatever the other one was, I can't quite remember. But the point I want to make here is these are all succulents. They all have the same micro environment requirements. So they're all going to be happy with wherever you place that plant and however you water it. Here's another idea where you've got some milk crates with some burlap, some vegetables. Again, the ideas of how you want to use containers, it's really use your imagination. Just keep in mind what the effects are going to be on the drainage for the plants that you place in these type of containers. Here's some boots hanging on a fence, utilizing some stone blocks to take advantage of these stone blocks. Probably would have been there all by themselves, but you can enhance it by putting some plants inside of those blocks to give you a little added pop. Here's a little truck. I'm assuming that the child that used to play with that's no longer around. And then some purses that people have put plants in. Here's some different ideas of some stacked pots. Here's some bromeliads in a container, elongated container. These containers too, I mean, these plants are actually planted within the container, but this is another example where you can take plants in smaller containers that might have different requirements, but you can place those plants in that container and still get the benefit of enjoying that container, but have multiple plants within it that might have different requirements. Here's some other plants that are planted together. Again, you've got on the left-hand side here, the white flowers give you some height. You've got some flowers there. And then on the right-hand side, same concept. Here, I want to emphasize these containers and what's behind them. You can see behind the one on the left, you've got a dark green plant growing on the fence. So the plant here in the foreground in the container is a lighter colored green, so it gives you a nice contrast between the two and allows both of them to be more noticeable by putting them in a place together. Same thing on the right side. You can see the plants in the back are darker green. The plant in the container is a lighter green, so it gives you that contrast and allows the container plant to give you that extra pop and focal point within your garden. And here's another container with some flowers. Additional ones. Again, you can see the advantage of the container. You had a bare spot there in the landscape there on the left. Just planted that container right in between, right in the landscape. Gave you some height and again, some contrast within the landscape with the other plants. Again, here's several plants grouped together to give you a different color and texture. There's a couple plants. One thing I meant to mention regarding containers and the shape of the container, something you want to keep in mind, and I found this out the hard way. So you see this container, how it's shaped where the middle of the container is wider than the top and the bottom. Something to remember, if you decide to go ahead and plant soil and the plant within that container, once that plant grows out and fills out with roots, you're going to have a real difficult time getting that plant out of that container. So this is a container that I would highly recommend you use the container within a container method, because that way it's going to be much easier to pull that container out, put another one in there or repot it, as opposed to putting it directly in that pot and then trying to repot it and get that plant out of there. So it's very challenging to try to do, and you're going to damage the roots doing it that way. So just something to keep in mind. Again, plants are grouped together. And based on what we talked about, if you apply Florida-friendly principles, make sure that you apply the correct microenvironment based on what that plant needs. You're gonna have happy plants, and of course, ultimately, you're gonna have a happy gardener. So with that,
Have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out to us by phone, email, visit our website. You can even follow us on social media at Polk Gardening.